While we're in the Old Testament, I want to ask you something I saw in the book of Job that seems right up your alley. I looked at this book, I can't remember who wrote it anymore, you may even know, I expect so you will. It was a book of engravings from the book of Job by the British writer and poet William Blake. Blake had done this series of engravings based on the trials and tests that Job went through.
Yep.
In these series of engravings, Yahweh and Yahweh and Job are depicted as sort of identical. You know, they're one's in a celestial realm, one's in a terrestrial realm. At the beginning of the image, Job and his family are depicted in front of the tree of life. The instruments hang in the trees, the animals are sleeping. By the end of the image, after these various trials, you know, after Job has been tested, and we're to assume, I suppose, that there's been this journey of self, capital S, realization through these trials. The instruments are being played, the animals are awake, you know, and there's a sort of a bright future, and there's some sort of astronomical stuff, i.e. the positioning of the sun and moon is somehow meant to be significant also, and the person that wrote this book is a Jungian. Now, the thing that struck me deep, and I've been struggling with it ever since, is there's a moment where Yahweh shows the behemoth and the leviathan to Job, and he says, "These I made as I made thee."
Right.
And then in this Jungian analysis of these engravings, the writer says that that God requires of us that we be good, that goodness itself may exist, that there is something beyond but comparable to neutrality in God the Creator, the idea of God the Creator. The image of the behemoth and the leviathan in these engravings is terrifying. The animalism of the behemoth, its musculature, its rawness. The leviathan, sneaky, dark, deep, terrifying thing. This idea of agency and God, this relationship between the unmanifest and the manifest as achieved through an individual's relationship with truth and expression, seemed to me that it was saying something that was right on the precipice of my ability to understand and certainly to convey.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is, well, one of the indications that you're open is the way that you phrased that question. Because there's like 30 things happening in that question all at the same time. And one of the things that creative people do is they throw out like images, because your question was full of images. You're trying to map territory that you don't understand. You say, here's an image, and here's an image, and here's an image, and here's an image, and there's something uniting all of those, but I don't know what it is. It's like, well, that's what artists do, by the way. And so that's a preliminary mapping of unexplored territory. And so we could take that apart a little bit. I mean, one of the things, so Job is objecting to his treatment because, of course, God has a bet with the devil, basically, that he can take Job down and make him curse fate. He basically bets the devil that he can turn Job into Cain. And God says, the devil bets God that he can turn Job into Cain by tormenting him. And God says, no, Job's a good man. No matter what you do to him, he won't lose faith in being. That's essentially the bet. And you think, well, that's a hell of a thing for God to do. But then, and Job objects to God to some degree. And so he's got his reasons, man. I mean, because everything's taken away from him. And God says, I made these things, the Leviathan, so that's like the terrible element of nature. And I made the Behemoth, and maybe you could say that's the terrible element of society. It's like, how dare you question me? And that's a perfectly reasonable objection. It's like, really, doesn't matter what happens, you're going to question God? Really? Well, so God objects to that. And then although Jung believed that Job actually had the moral upper hand in that description because God behaved rather reprehensibly in having a bet with the devil. I mean, Jung wrote a book called Answer to Job, which is very much worth reading. It's quite a profound piece of work. But then you also wove into the question this idea of the ethical requirement to be good. Yeah. And there's something in that that's unutterably deep, because this is right at the limit of my ability to understand things too, so it's speculative beyond belief. But it seems to me that we are thrown challenges, and that in some sense those are best construed as tests of our ethical ability. So what Jung thought, his idea was something like this, that at the beginning of time people were unconscious, and that consciousness emerged with all of its catastrophes, consciousness of death, for example. And one way out of the burden of consciousness was to return to unconsciousness. You can do that with alcohol. You can do that by being dependent. You can do that by failing to grow up. You refuse the burden of consciousness by becoming unconscious again. But there's another way forward, which is to become even more conscious. So the idea would be a little bit of consciousness is like an illness. But if you can expand that consciousness upwards enough, then it starts to become something that is its own cure. And that partly what your goal is while you suffer through life is to heighten your consciousness to the point where everything gets integrated enough so that that's proper medication for the disease of self-consciousness. And Jung believed that that was really that was one of the ideas that ran through the entire structure of Judeo-Christianity, although it wouldn't be limited to Judeo-Christianity. So it's more consciousness rather than less. It's more attention. And I think there's something to that. And some of that, see, the other thing you see in psychotherapy, for example, is that when you're trying to lead people forward out of the darkness, let's say, out of anxiety and depression and despair and resentment and bitterness and anger and all of those things, catastrophic interactions with their family, is that you get them to stop avoiding confronting the terrible things that are in front of them, right? So basically what you do, instead of saying to them, you know, those terrible things that are happening, just ignore those and find some peace, right? Get your mind away from it. That isn't what you say. You say, turn around and look at them even more than you've been looking at them. It's very paradoxical advice, but of all the things that have been proven to aid people's recovery and movement towards mental health, that's like at the top of the list. Voluntary confrontation with what you are afraid of, or what you despise, even, for that matter. And so Jung had an axiom that he derived from the alchemists, which was insterquilinus invenitur, which roughly meant that which you most need will be found where you least want to look. Which is,
fuck man.
Yeah. Well, that was also his explanation for why people weren't enlightened. Because you think, well, the California approach to enlightenment, to speak, kind of satirically, is follow your bliss. It's like, well, that's easy. If that was the case, everyone would be enlightened. But the Jungian approach is, no. You do what's meaningful and pay attention, follow the truth, and it will take you to the worst place you can imagine. And then maybe there's some chance for enlightenment.
Campbell somewhat revoked that I follow your bliss mantra, though, by saying he wished he'd said follow your blisters. Like what you should follow is the pain.
Yeah.
And
I didn't know he said that.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? Well, it's wicked. Put that on the scoreboard.
Oh, that's good.
Like another thing. Like, I know I've been thrown because you've said that I said something that you didn't know, and it's unravelled my entire Weltanschauung. And now I've reached for a bit of German language to pull my way back in. Oh yeah, Herman Melville, he'll help me out.